When you rewind the story of humanity, past the rise of Egypt, past the first dynasties of China, past every empire that shaped our textbooks, you eventually reach a point where the world becomes quiet. Villages scatter like small sparks in the dark. People farm in simple communities, and history seems almost empty. Then, without warning, a blazing light appears on the plains of southern Mesopotamia. A civilization rises so suddenly, so completely, and so mysteriously that modern researchers are still struggling to explain how it happened. That civilization was Sumer. The Sumerians did not slowly grow from primitive settlements into a complex society. They arrived in history already capable of building monumental cities, organizing governments, drafting legal systems, cultivating advanced agriculture, and, most astonishing of all, writing. Cuneiform, the earliest known writing system in the world, appears fully developed in their earliest layers. It is as if someone skipped every step of human development and jumped straight to the final stage. No one knows why. No one knows how. What makes their sudden arrival even stranger is that the Sumerian language does not resemble any other. It is not Semitic, not Indo-European, not related to languages of the Caucasus or Anatolia. It has no linguistic ancestors. In archaeology, this is incredibly rare. Entire civilizations leave behind cultural roots, evolutionary layers, pottery transitions, settlement patterns. But for Sumer, those layers are missing. They simply appear, complete, organized, and ahead of their time. Archaeologists call this the Sumerian problem. It is the moment history stops following a smooth curve and instead leaps upward like a vertical line. Cities such as Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and Kish emerge with administrative districts, temples, granaries, irrigation canals, marketplaces, and defensive walls. Uruk alone may have held over 40,000 inhabitants at a time when most of the world still lived in tribes. The scale is staggering, and it happens far earlier than expected. The Sumerians themselves claimed that civilization did not begin with them, but was lowered from the heavens. Kingship, wisdom, and knowledge were gifts bestowed upon humanity, not inventions created slowly over centuries. To modern ears, these statements sound mythological, yet they consistently appear across their earliest tablets. Even if symbolic, the question remains, why did they describe their origins as an act of descent, not development? What truly unsettles researchers is the speed of their achievements. Within a few centuries, an instant in historical terms, they mastered wheel technology, created the first schools, designed complex irrigation systems, established legal codes, defined time in units of 12, 24, and 60, and studied the skies with a precision that feels shockingly modern. It is easy to underestimate how advanced these people were, but their clay tablets reveal a mindset of measurement, observation, and systemization that feels thousands of years ahead of surrounding cultures. And then there are the records, the tablets that defy simple explanation. Some contain astronomical calculations so accurate that modern scientists still debate how they were performed without instruments. Others list kings ruling tens of thousands of years, a concept unacceptable to conventional history but undeniably present in the texts. Flood narratives resemble those found across dozens of civilizations worldwide, raising the possibility of a shared ancient memory. And scattered throughout the archive are descriptions of beings from the sky, delivering knowledge and authority to early humanity. Scholars disagree on what these writings mean. Some interpret them as symbolic myths. Others believe they preserve fragments of real events distorted over time. A smaller group argues that the sudden brilliance of Sumer hints at knowledge inherited from an older, forgotten culture, one erased by natural catastrophe. None of these theories fully satisfy the evidence, yet all remain on the table because the truth is still beyond our reach. The Sumerians were not just the first civilization. They were an anomaly, a disruption in the expected timeline of human progress. Their records do not simply document daily life. They challenge our assumptions about where knowledge comes from, how societies form, and what may have existed before written history began. And if even a single thread of their story points to something older, deeper, or more extraordinary than we currently believe, then the history of humanity is far from complete. As the first cities grew, the Sumerians built not just structures, but systems, intricate, organized, and astonishingly advanced for their age. Their world was dense with ideas that seemed to emerge fully formed. They developed mathematics based on the number 60, a system so precise and practical that we still use it today to measure minutes and seconds. They divided the heavens into pathways, plotted the movement of celestial bodies, and created calendars aligned with lunar cycles. These were not simple observations. They were structured, consistent, and recorded with a confidence that suggests they already understood far more than a newly formed civilization should. Their legal systems were similarly advanced. Contracts, sales, marriages, inheritances, debts, everything was written, stamped, documented. These practices reveal a society obsessed with record-keeping and precision. It is difficult to imagine that such complexity blossomed suddenly in a place with no clear developmental predecessors. And yet, that is exactly what the archaeological layers imply. Even their economy was sophisticated. Long-distance trade connected Sumer with regions hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. Copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from the Levant, gold from Anatolia. Goods traveled vast distances to reach Sumer's bustling cities. For a supposedly earliest civilization, Sumer operated like a well-connected hub in a global network long before such networks were believed to exist. How did they learn to navigate vast deserts and hostile terrains? Who taught them to standardize measures, weights, and exchange systems? These questions linger without satisfying answers. Their irrigation systems raise similar puzzles. Controlling water is among the greatest challenges of ancient societies, yet the Sumerians engineered canals, levees, reservoirs, and floodgates on a scale that took later civilizations centuries to match. Their knowledge of hydrology, soil management, and seasonal cycles was not primitive, it was systematic. It transformed barren plains into fertile farmlands capable of supporting dense populations. Nothing about this resembles an experimental first attempt. It has the signature of refinement, of inherited expertise. But perhaps the most extraordinary indicator of their intellectual leap is the emergence of scribes, the world's first professional class of writers, trained in schools that taught language, mathematics, administration, religion, and celestial observation. This was not accidental. It was an institution built to preserve and transmit knowledge with accuracy across generations. And within their tablets lies the strongest argument that Sumer's achievements cannot be explained simply by local development. Because the tablets reveal something deeper. The Sumerians did not consider themselves pioneers. They consistently wrote as if they were preserving knowledge that already existed before them. They described cities built in ancient days, before the flood. They recorded that kingship and culture descended from above. They spoke of earlier eras, earlier beings, earlier cycles of civilization. Even if interpreted symbolically, the consistency of these claims is striking. Their myths, too, contain hints that they saw themselves as inheritors rather than originators. The god Enki granting humans wisdom, the Anunnaki establishing order, the flood wiping out a previous age. These stories may be religious, but embedded within them is a recurring theme. Something came before, and it was powerful enough to shape what came after. From a scientific perspective, these statements cannot be accepted literally. But the historical puzzle remains. Why would the world's earliest known civilization refuse to take credit for its own achievements? Why insist that knowledge was given, not discovered? Why portray their most foundational advances as gifts from an earlier, greater source? Modern scholars attempt to explain this by pointing to the human tendency to mythologize origins. Yet the Sumerians were unusually literal in their record-keeping. They documented grain harvests, business transactions, legal disputes, temple inventories, astronomical cycles, doctors' treatments, and school exercises with meticulous detail. And the same people who wrote with such precision about everyday life also wrote of eras before the flood, rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, and knowledge descending from the sky. This mismatch between the heavily factual tone of their tablets and the mythic scale of their origins lies at the heart of the Sumerian mystery. If the Sumerians exaggerated, why exaggerate in ways that contradict their otherwise grounded worldview? If they inherited their stories, from whom? And why do elements of these stories appear nearly unchanged in civilizations scattered across the world? By the end of their first millennium, Sumer had laid the foundations for writing, astronomy, city planning, agriculture, trade networks, mathematics, and governance. Everything that came after, from Babylonian star charts to Greek philosophy to Roman law, carries the imprint of Sumerian structure. They were the beginning. Yet the more we uncover about them, the more it feels as though we are looking not at the start of civilization, but at the remnants of knowledge passed down from an older, forgotten chapter of human history. If the first civilization was already this advanced, then what happened before? As the world's first true cities took shape, Sumer became a landscape unlike anything humanity had seen before. Brick by brick, its people transformed the floodplains into dense urban centers filled with noise, trade, ritual, and ambition. When we imagine ancient cities, we often picture ruins, sand, and quiet temples. But Sumer, it was alive. Crowded streets, marketplaces buzzing, livestock bleating, scribes rushing with tablets, priests chanting hymns in towering temples that cast shadows across entire districts. Civilization, in its most literal sense, began here. Uruk is the most iconic example. Its walls stretched so far that later kings boasted simply about walking around them. Its central district, dominated by the temples of Inanna and Anu, pulsed with religious ceremonies, political decisions, and economic activity. Everything about Uruk signals a society that had already mastered organization on a scale that should have taken centuries to develop, yet appears abruptly in the archaeological layers. Even today, it feels as though we are missing pieces of the developmental staircase that should have led up to this height. Other cities followed similar patterns. Eridu, often called the first city ever built, was revered by the Sumerians as the birthplace of kingship itself. Lagash grew into a powerful administrative hub. Nippur became the spiritual heart of the region. Each city had a unique identity, yet they shared a remarkably consistent architecture: monumental temples, administrative storehouses, standardized housing, carefully planned canals, and marketplaces designed for large-scale exchange. It was urban planning before the concept of urban planning existed. What truly surprised archaeologists was how these cities interacted. They were not isolated experiments, but part of a broader network. Each city-state with its own ruler, its own patron deity, its own economy, yet deeply connected through trade, diplomacy, and occasionally war. This complexity suggests a population comfortable with laws, taxation, and written records, long before such systems were considered necessary in human development. And still, no clear precursor culture explains how this level of organization emerged. Long-distance trade is one of the most perplexing aspects. The Sumerians had little stone, little metal, few trees, yet they constructed monumental buildings, crafted metal tools, and carved intricate artwork. This was only possible because they acquired materials from afar: copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon, tin from Iran, gold from Anatolia. To maintain such networks required knowledge of geography, navigation, and logistics that scholars struggle to attribute to such an early period. Somehow, the Sumerians not only managed it, but made it routine. Equally impressive was their agricultural system. Harnessing the unpredictable rivers of Mesopotamia demanded intelligence, precision, and foresight. The Sumerians built miles of canals, dikes, reservoirs, and water gates. They mastered crop cycles, soil chemistry, and flood management. To turn marshlands into arable farmland at scale is no small feat. It is the result of advanced observation accumulated over long periods. Yet again, Sumer presents us with expertise that arrives too quickly, appearing much like a knowledge base inherited rather than invented. Within these cities, life became increasingly structured. Social hierarchies hardened. Priests, administrators, merchants, craftsmen, soldiers, farmers, each role was distinct. Taxes were recorded on clay tablets. Court cases were documented and archived. Deeds, land sales, grain deliveries, temple offerings, labor quotas, everything was written down. Even beer rations were standardized and encoded. This was not just a civilization. It was a civilization obsessed with documentation. And documentation, by nature, belongs to societies that have been operating complex systems for a long time. Yet the deeper we go into the written records, the stranger the puzzle becomes. The earliest administrative tablets already reflect mastery of writing. They do not show a gradual evolution from pictograms to abstract symbols. Instead, they leap into existence with dozens of standardized signs, numerical systems, and grammatical structures. It is the same pattern we observed in their cities. No prototypes, no intermediate trial phases, no developmental arc. Precision without practice. Why is this important? Because the level of refinement seen in Sumer's cities suggests that someone, somewhere, had to learn these lessons the hard way, through failed attempts, collapsed settlements, resource shortages, and the slow accumulation of knowledge. But Sumer shows almost none of those scars. Its earliest cities appear as if planned by minds already familiar with complex social engineering. Scientists try to explain this with population pressure, environmental necessity, and agricultural surplus. These factors certainly matter, yet they do not fully explain the uniformity and speed of Sumer's rise. Something accelerated them. Something gave them a head start. Whether it was inherited knowledge, a lost earlier culture, or simply a stroke of historical luck, the fact remains: Sumer did not climb to the summit of civilization step by step. They began near the top. And if the first civilization began with such momentum, then the question becomes unavoidable. What source of knowledge stood behind it? The deeper we look into Sumer, the clearer it becomes that this civilization operated on a level of coordination that feels completely out of place for its age. Their cities did not simply coexist. They formed an interconnected web with shared standards, shared measurements, and shared systems of governance. The very idea of standardized weights and measures appears in their records almost immediately, suggesting that trade between cities had already reached a level of sophistication that normally takes centuries to develop. Yet the archaeological layers show no slow buildup. Instead, complex economic cooperation arrives fully matured. Their merchant class traveled astonishing distances, mapping trade routes across deserts and mountains long before the existence of compasses or advanced navigation tools. The Sumerians seemed to understand the reliability of caravans, the seasonality of faraway lands, and the value of materials so rare that reaching them required months of travel. This level of reach implies not only boldness, but knowledge. Knowledge that a supposedly first civilization should not reasonably possess from scratch. It raises a persistent question. Why did they begin so far ahead of the starting line? Religious and political authority blended seamlessly in these early city-states. Each city had a ruling figure, yet kingship was never portrayed as something that humans invented. In their own writings, rulers did not take power, they were assigned, appointed, or lowered from above. This belief shaped every aspect of Sumerian life. Priests managed temples as administrative, economic, and spiritual centers simultaneously. They controlled grain storage, workforce coordination, building projects, and the distribution of goods. And they did this with remarkable efficiency. Their records show balanced accounts, debt tracking, labor quotas, and temple contributions that reflect a society deeply familiar with organizational structure. At the heart of all this was an economy that required large-scale planning. Irrigation maintenance alone involved thousands of workers, seasonal schedules, and continuous oversight. The Sumerians understood that one blocked canal or mismanaged flood could devastate entire regions. Somehow, they achieved a level of coordination so complete that multiple cities thrived simultaneously without collapsing from internal mismanagement, something that even later empires struggled to accomplish. But nothing is more revealing about their intellectual world than the clay tablets left behind. These documents do not read like the hesitant, experimental writings of a culture learning literacy for the first time. They read like the output of a society that had already been writing, perhaps not on clay, perhaps not in cuneiform, but writing in some organized form long before the tablets we have today. Administrative lists use complex numerical systems without introductory phases. Legal disputes cite precedents that no earlier records explain. Economic tallies use ratios and conversions as if they had existed for generations. This is why so many researchers feel that something is missing. A developmental era should exist beneath Sumer's earliest layers, an era where the ideas that shaped city life were tested, refined, and corrected. Yet the more we dig, the more the past refuses to reveal any such period. Instead, Sumer stands like an island of brilliance rising suddenly above the prehistoric landscape. One cannot help noticing how often the Sumerians describe their own knowledge as inherited. They wrote of earlier ages, earlier cities, earlier rulers, events supposedly taking place before the Great Flood. They repeatedly claimed that the foundations of civilization were not discovered by them, but delivered. Even if these accounts are symbolic, the consistency across tablets suggests a strong cultural memory of something before them, something they believed was real enough to define their identity. Their monumental temples, the ziggurats, reinforced this sense of inheritance. They were built in layered stages, each new generation repairing, enlarging, or rebuilding upon the foundations of the old. Archaeologists have found up to 18 rebuilding phases in a single temple. This pattern hints at long-term cultural continuity, yet the earliest layers are already advanced. Once again, the beginning is missing. By the time Sumer reached its classical height, the system was running so smoothly that it feels less like the dawn of civilization and more like a continuation of something older, now resurfacing. And as we move deeper into their records filled with astronomical precision, kingdoms older than agriculture, and stories of catastrophic floods, the mystery only grows. If Sumer truly stands at the foundation of recorded history, then why does everything about them feel like a second beginning, rather than the first? From the moment writing appeared in Sumer, it reshaped everything. The world suddenly had memory. Ideas no longer lived and died with individuals, but were pressed into clay, permanent, transferable, immune to time. Yet the emergence of cuneiform is one of the strangest developments in ancient history, because it does not begin like a newborn writing system. It begins already structured, already complex, already capable of expressing contracts, prayers, astronomy, taxes, myths, laws, and numbers. It arrives not as an experiment, but as a tool perfected enough to handle the entire weight of a civilization. The earliest tablets are administrative, filled with grain counts, livestock tallies, and labor assignments, but even these are unnervingly sophisticated. They use numerical groupings, standardized signs, positional meaning, and abstract symbols that imply a long period of conceptual development. Yet no such developmental phase has ever been found. Instead of evolving from simple drawings into more advanced forms, cuneiform appears abruptly with dozens of symbols already defined. It's as if Sumer's first written words were not the beginning of writing, but the continuation of a writing tradition that existed long before clay tablets were adopted. What makes this even more puzzling is the speed at which the writing expanded. Within only a few generations, the same script that began as a bookkeeping system was being used to compose hymns, medical texts, legal rulings, king lists, myths of creation, flood narratives, and astronomical observations. This jump from accounting to cosmology is something that normally takes centuries, but in Sumer, it happens almost instantly, without hesitation, without a visible learning curve. It suggests a society already comfortable with symbolic thought, abstraction, and narrative structure long before their first surviving documents were written. Scribes, the men who produced these tablets, became one of the most important classes in Sumerian society. Their training was rigorous, involving memorization of hundreds of signs, practice in mathematics, and mastery of legal and administrative formulae. The existence of formal scribal schools in such an early period is itself astonishing. These institutions required not only literacy but an organized curriculum, a large archive of texts, and a cultural belief in the value of preserving knowledge. All of this appears in Sumer almost from the beginning, leaving scholars to wonder who established such systems if Sumer was truly the first civilization. The content of the tablets the mystery even further. Alongside the practical records of daily life are texts that describe the structure of the heavens, the cycles of the moon and planets, the rituals of temples, the origins of humanity, and the rules by which kings were chosen. These early myths are not simple stories. They are part theological, part historical, and part scientific. They describe forces beyond human control with remarkable detail, hinting at a worldview far more advanced than expected for such an ancient culture. And scattered among the tablets are writings that feel deeply out of place. Lists of rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, descriptions of cities said to have existed before the Great Flood, accounts of beings who descended from above to govern and instruct, and genealogies that stretch back into a past that science cannot reconcile with human timelines. These were not fringe texts. They were copied and recopied in scribal schools for centuries, suggesting that the Sumerians believed them to reflect some form of truth, however symbolic. Even their astronomical records challenge conventional explanations. Some tablets show observations of planetary movements with a level of accuracy difficult to achieve without instruments. The scribes described the rising and setting of Venus, lunar eclipses, and celestial omens with a precision that seems disproportionate to the technological environment of the time. They did not treat the sky as a source of myth alone, but as a system that could be studied, predicted, and interpreted. This dual nature, mythic yet mathematical, is one of the defining characteristics of Sumerian intellectual life. Modern scholars sometimes argue that the Sumerians simply had centuries of oral tradition before recording their knowledge in clay. But even if true, it still does not explain the consistency, sophistication, and volume of these early writings. Oral cultures can preserve stories, but they do not typically produce fully formed scientific frameworks the moment writing appears. Something about Sumer defies the expected progression. The first civilization should show signs of experimentation, mistakes, transitions, but instead, it shows mastery. At its core, the mystery of Cuneiform is the mystery of Sumer itself. It is not just that writing began here, it is that writing began already capable of carrying enormous intellectual weight. It recorded the rhythms of the cosmos, the structure of politics, the memory of disasters, the genealogy of rulers, and the principles that shaped daily life. Through these tablets, Sumer speaks, and what it says is far older, far grander, and far stranger than the world we thought existed at the dawn of civilization. The more scholars translate the Sumerian tablets, the more they realize these records are not merely the writings of a young civilization. They are windows into a worldview that feels unexpectedly layered, as if Sumer carried echoes of something older. The tablets blend practical knowledge, religious mythology, astronomical precision, political history, and philosophical speculation into a single, continuous, intellectual tradition. No other early culture does this with such confidence. Most civilizations begin with fragmented notes, scattered myths, or simple records. The Sumerians begin with complexity already woven into their writing. As scribes expanded their repertoire, they began producing texts that blurred the line between observation and revelation. Some tablets describe celestial events in exacting detail, predicting the visibility of Venus, charting lunar cycles, or recording rare alignments in the sky. Others explore the origin of kingship, stating that authority was sent down from the heavens at the dawn of time. Still others recount the eras before the flood, periods in which cities flourished, rulers reigned impossibly long lives, and the gods walked among humans as instructors and judges. The mixture of myth and meticulous record-keeping has puzzled researchers for more than a century. To understand why this is so unusual, consider how human writing typically evolves. Early writing systems around the world begin as rudimentary marks used for trade or ritual. Only after long development do they grow into literary or scientific tools. But in Sumer's earliest layers, the leap has already happened. You find lists of stars, catalogs of plants and animals, medical texts outlining treatments, and hymns that reference cosmological structures. There are tablets that describe the rhythm of the universe as if the scribes were confident they could understand it. This confidence suggests a culture already deeply familiar with symbolic thought and scientific curiosity. Even more troubling for traditional history are the tablets that seem to preserve memories of events too ancient to align with archaeological timelines. The Sumerians wrote of cities they believed existed before the flood, of dynasties erased by catastrophe, and of kings whose reigns spanned thousands of years. These durations are impossible in biological terms, yet the Sumerians listed them alongside genuine historical figures without distinction. Modern historians treat these early reigns as symbolic exaggerations or numerological statements, but no one can fully explain why the Sumerians would preserve such timelines so systematically if they did not believe them to reflect some deeper truth. The consistency across different cities and time periods is also striking. A myth copied in Nippur appears with the same sequence of events in Uruk, and Lagash. Celestial omens used the same interpretive rules across centuries. Even the structure of their creation myths maintains a stable logic. Humanity is shaped, instructed, and organized by beings associated with the sky, with wisdom descending rather than emerging. Whether understood literally or metaphorically, this worldview shaped every part of Sumerian intellectual life. Some researchers propose that the Sumerians inherited these stories from earlier populations displaced by climate events, such as the dramatic flooding that followed the last ice age. If fragments of older cultures survived through oral tradition, then Sumer's myths could reflect memories from a time and place lost to archaeology. This theory is difficult to confirm, but it explains why the Sumerians wrote with such certainty about eras we cannot verify. Others argue that these myths are purely theological expressions meant to legitimize kingship. Yet the astronomical material complicates this view. Myths can explain divine order, but they do not normally rely on detailed star charts. Another layer of mystery lies in the tablets that remain untranslated or only partially understood. Thousands of fragments sit in museums, containing symbols that have no clear parallels in known Sumerian vocabulary. Some depict abstract diagrams that scholars struggle to interpret. Are they ritual images, calendrical tools, maps, mathematical models? The ambiguity grows as more tablets are unearthed. For every record that clarifies the ancient world, another appears to deepen the enigma. It is as if the Sumerians recorded more than they expected future civilizations to understand. But perhaps the most compelling aspect of these writings is how seamlessly they combine empirical observation with mythic narrative. A tablet may begin with a list of grain allotments, shift into a story about a god descending from the heavens, and conclude with the prediction of an eclipse, all written in the same script, in the same matter-of-fact tone. This blending challenges modern categories. The Sumerians did not separate the sacred from the scientific. They saw the universe as a single system, one that could be observed, recorded, and interpreted in many layers. Through their tablets, we encounter a people who believed that knowledge was not merely acquired, but remembered. They saw themselves as participants in a cosmic story stretching far beyond their lifetimes. Whether their writings preserve literal history, symbolic truths, or fragments of a forgotten past, the effect is the same. They leave us with questions that no modern framework fully answers. In the end, the puzzle of cuneiform is not simply about deciphering ancient symbols. It is about confronting the possibility that the first civilization to write may not have been the first to know. And if Sumer truly carried echoes of a world before the flood, then their tablets are not just records. They are warnings, memories, and invitations to reconsider everything we believe about the origins of human history. Among all the Sumerian writings that have survived, none has generated more debate, confusion, and fascination than the document now known as the Sumerian King List. At first glance, it appears to be a straightforward historical record, names of rulers, durations of reign, and the cities from which they governed. But the deeper one reads, the more the tablet begins to resemble something entirely different. It does not simply describe kings. It describes ages, worlds, and cycles of civilization that extend far beyond the boundaries of accepted history. It is a text that makes even seasoned scholars pause, because it operates on a scale that seems incompatible with human lifespans or conventional archaeology. The King List begins with a phrase repeated in multiple versions. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. This sentence sets the tone for the entire document. Authority does not emerge. It descends. Civilization is not discovered. It is bestowed. The first rulers in the list are said to have reigned for thousands of years, some for tens of thousands. Alulim, the first king, is recorded as ruling for over 28,000 years. His successor, Al-Algar, reigns for 36,000. These figures challenge biological possibility, yet the Sumerians recorded them without hesitation, placing them at the foundation of their historical memory. Many attempts have been made to interpret these numbers. Some argue they are symbolic, encoding astronomical cycles or ritual calendars. Others suggest they reflect dynastic totals rather than individual reigns. Still others believe the tablets preserve distorted memories of real events passed down through countless generations of oral tradition. Yet none of these explanations fully resolves the puzzle. If the numbers were symbolic, why did the scribes apply them with such precision? If they were metaphorical, why blend them seamlessly with historically verifiable kings later in the list? The structure of the king list becomes even stranger after the section describing these impossibly long reigns. The text abruptly shifts, announcing a massive catastrophe. Then the flood swept over. This dividing line separates two worlds, the era before the flood, when kings ruled for tens of millennia, and the era after, when reigns become shorter, more familiar, and eventually align with archaeological evidence. It is as if the Sumerians believed that time itself changed after this cosmic event. Lifespans contracted, authority redistributed, and civilization had to begin again. The consistency of this structure across versions suggests that the flood was not just a myth but a pivotal event in their collective understanding of history. What complicates matters further is that variations of the king list have been found across different Sumerian and Babylonian cities, yet they all maintain the same underlying framework. Though names and spellings differ, the pattern remains. Impossibly long-lived rulers before the flood, followed by more realistic reigns afterward. This is not the behavior of random storytelling, but of a deeply rooted cultural narrative preserved with care. It implies that the Sumerians believed they were recording something foundational, something that defined the boundary between the ancient world and their own. Archaeologists struggle to reconcile this with the physical evidence. There is no sign of a civilization that could have existed tens of thousands of years before Sumer. Yet the Sumerians insisted that kingship had a pre-flood history, one that stretched across vast spans of time. Some scholars speculate that these exaggerated reigns reflect memories of earlier, loosely organized societies mythologized over centuries. Others argue that they encode environmental cycles or astronomical patterns. But no interpretation fully captures why the Sumerians inserted such specific chronological detail into what appears to be a political document. The king list also lists cities that supposedly existed before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Uruk, Sippar, Shuruppak. Some of these, like Eridu, indeed appear extremely ancient in the archaeological record. Others remain enigmatic, with layers destroyed or buried beyond current excavation limits. The idea that Sumerian cities had pre-flood histories does not align with modern timelines, yet the tablets treat these eras as real chapters in their civilization story. It is possible that the Sumerians inherited fragmented memories of earlier settlements destroyed by climate events, but even this theory leaves unanswered questions about the long reigns. One detail often overlooked is how confidently the Sumerians blended mythic chronology with practical history. Later kings, those whose reigns align with archaeological timelines, are recorded in the same style as their impossible predecessors. This suggests that, to the Sumerians, the border between myth and history was not a sharp divide. The ancient kings were not fictional characters to them. They were part of a lineage stretching back to the dawn of order. The king list is therefore more than a record of rulers. It is a statement about how the Sumerians understood the flow of time, the inheritance of power, and the nature of civilization itself. It presents history not as a straight line, but as a cycle interrupted by catastrophe and renewal. And embedded within its structure is a message that continues to challenge modern assumptions. If the earliest civilization insisted that others came before it, what exactly were they remembering? The more one studies the Sumerian king list, the more it feels like a doorway into a worldview that refuses to fit into modern frameworks. The tablet does not behave like mythology, yet it does not conform to conventional history either. It sits somewhere in between, in a space where memory, legend, astronomy, and political ideology overlap. And the deeper scholars go into its structure, the more they realize that the document might contain layers of meaning that were obvious to the Sumerians, but lost to us. One of the most striking features is the way the list maintains coherence across countless copies spanning centuries. Scribes in different cities, under different rulers, replicated its structure faithfully. The impossibly long-lived kings before the flood, the destruction of the old world, and the re-establishment of kingship afterward. This consistency suggests that the text was treated as authoritative, not as a creative retelling. It may have been regarded the way we treat foundational history books, documents that define origins rather than interpret them. Yet this raises an unsettling possibility. If the Sumerians viewed these pre-flood kings as real, then their understanding of human antiquity was radically different from ours. They believed civilization had a deep past, interrupted by catastrophe, and that their own cities were merely the latest expressions of a recurring pattern. This belief shows up not only in the king list, but in myths, hymns, and administrative rituals. Kings often invoked ancient predecessors as if they were part of a continuous lineage. The flood was not a symbolic reset. It was a historical boundary that marked the transition from a great but lost age to a more fragile human one. Some scholars have attempted to decode the impossible reign lengths by converting the numbers into lunar cycles, seasons, or astronomical periods, hoping to uncover a hidden mathematical logic. The results are inconclusive. Patterns emerge, but none explain the full structure. Others have proposed that the early kings represent clans or dynasties rather than individuals, but this too struggles to explain why reigns later in the list become strictly individual and historically accurate. It is as if the Sumerians were documenting two different types of time, mythic time and human time. Yet they saw them as part of one story.
What's even more intriguing is that archaeological evidence does show dramatic environmental events in ancient Mesopotamia. River shifts, sudden floods, soil salinization, and settlement collapses. Though none correspond exactly to the biblical or Sumerian flood story, they reveal a landscape where catastrophic events were not only possible, but common. Some researchers speculate that memories of a much older, larger flood, perhaps one tied to the melting of Ice Age glaciers or the flooding of the Persian Gulf Basin, could have been transmitted across generations, eventually merging into the Sumerian narrative. If so, the king list may preserve fragments of a prehistoric memory encoded into mythic chronology. But even this does not explain the astonishing durations of the early reigns. The idea that the first rulers lived tens of thousands of years seems biologically impossible unless read metaphorically. Yet the Sumerians did not annotate them as metaphor. The numbers are listed with the same administrative tone used for later kings whose reigns match archaeological facts. This lack of distinction is one of the most perplexing aspects of the list. It suggests that to the Sumerians, the age before the flood was fundamentally different, a world governed by rules unlike those of the present. Another curious aspect is the distribution of cities before and after the flood. Eridu, Badabira, Uruk, Sippar, and Shuruppak appear in the pre-flood section with majestic importance. After the flood, kingship moves among various city-states, Kish, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, mirroring political realities confirmed by excavations. This transition reinforces the idea that the first part of the list was not treated as mere storytelling. It functioned as the spiritual and political preamble to the chronological history of Sumer. Even the phrasing, "kingship was lowered from heaven," appears repeatedly in temple hymns and ritual inscriptions, suggesting the Sumerians saw authority as something external to humans, descending from a cosmic source. Whether interpreted as divine sanction or as a metaphor for inherited knowledge, the phrase points toward a worldview in which civilization is not a human invention, but a gift, or perhaps a legacy from a previous age. Modern scholars remain divided.
Some view the king list as a political tool designed to legitimize certain dynasties by rooting them in a divine past. Others argue that it preserves genuine oral traditions from long-lost cultures. Still others believe that the list reflects ancient attempts to mathematize time, using symbolic numbers to signal cycles rather than years. But none of these explanations fully resolve the central tension. Why did the Sumerians insist on blending mythic chronology with empirically verifiable history in a single, uninterrupted document? The king list forces us to confront a possibility that is uncomfortable for linear models of human development. The Sumerians did not see themselves as the first civilization. They saw themselves as inheritors of a broken timeline, the survivors of an age erased by flood and fire. And whether their memories reflect symbolic truths or remnants of something real, they challenge our assumption that history began when writing began. If the first writers believed they were already late to the story, how much earlier does that story really go? Among the thousands of clay tablets recovered from ancient Mesopotamia, one text stands out as the oldest surviving version of a story humanity would retell for millennia. The tale of a great flood that wiped out a world before ours. Known today as the Eridu Genesis, this Sumerian narrative predates the Babylonian Atrahasis, predates the Epic of Gilgamesh, and predates the biblical account of Noah by well over 1,000 years. What makes it astonishing is not just its age, but the clarity with which it describes a catastrophic event so immense that it became a defining boundary between two eras of existence. The Sumerians did not treat the flood as a myth. They treated it as a historical dividing line, the moment when a previous age ended and the world they knew began. The story opens with a world already organized into cities, temples, and rulers. Civilization exists, but humanity is not yet fully in control of its destiny. The gods watch over the cities: Eridu, Bad-Tabira, Uruk, Separ, Shurupak, and life appears orderly, flourishing. Yet something in this early world disturbs the divine order. The text is damaged in places, but the implication is unmistakable. Humanity became too noisy, too numerous, or too disruptive. The gods, or at least some of them, resolved to end the experiment. The decision to send a flood is described not as punishment, but as a reset, a wiping clean of a world that had drifted out of balance. But not all of the gods agreed. One deity, most versions name Enki, chooses to preserve life. He warns a man named Ziusudra, instructing him to build a vessel, collect animals, and prepare for the coming destruction. The parallels to later flood stories are striking, but what stands out most is the tone. The text does not read like allegory. It reads like the record of an event that shaped collective memory. Ziusudra survives the deluge, offers a sacrifice, and is granted eternal life in a distant land. The world after the flood is different, smaller, fragile, a place where kingship is redistributed and human lifespan is drastically reduced. In this way, the Eridu Genesis aligns perfectly with the structure of the Sumerian king list, which draws the same boundary between the pre-flood and post-flood ages. What makes the Sumerian flood story especially intriguing is how universal it feels. Civilizations on nearly every continent preserve myths of a great deluge, from India and China to Greece, from Native American tribes to ancient Mesoamerican cultures. Many of these stories feature remarkably similar motifs: a divine warning, a chosen survivor, a boat, a mountain of refuge, and the renewal of humanity after catastrophe. Scholars debate whether this universality points to a shared psychological pattern or to the memory of a real event preserved through oral tradition. But in the case of Sumer, the earliest written account locates the flood in a sequence of historical eras, not in the realm of myth. Environmental evidence adds another layer. Geological studies show abrupt flooding events in Mesopotamia, including massive river changes and sediment layers suggesting region-wide inundations. Some researchers connect these to melting glaciers at the end of the Ice Age, which would have rapidly flooded low-lying areas like the ancient Persian Gulf Basin, an area that may have once been habitable and densely populated. Others point to catastrophic river shifts that could have destroyed early settlements. No single flood matches the Sumerian description perfectly, yet the landscape itself shows a pattern of upheavals consistent with the memory of an overwhelming disaster. The Eridu Genesis also reveals how the Sumerians conceptualized the fragility of civilization. To them, cities were not eternal. They could rise and fall, flourish and vanish. The flood did not simply destroy buildings, it erased an entire phase of existence, leaving only fragments to be remembered.
What survived was kingship, which descended again after the waters receded. The idea that leadership returned from the heavens reflects their belief that the foundations of civilization were not human inventions but cosmic constants. Even after catastrophe, the pattern would repeat. Yet the most profound mystery lies not in the story itself but in its relationship to the broader Sumerian worldview. If the Sumerians were indeed the first civilization, why did they speak so confidently about a world before theirs? Why did they describe pre-flood cities with the same administrative detail used for their own? Why include flood as a factual boundary in both mythic and historical records? These questions trouble scholars because they imply that Sumer remembered something, whether real or imagined, that preceded their rise. Some argue that the flood story reflects memories of early Neolithic settlements destroyed by natural disasters. Others believe it symbolizes agricultural crises. But these interpretations do little to explain why the story appears in nearly identical form across cultures separated by oceans and continents. And they do not explain the eerie way the narrative meshes with the king list's chronology, as if both documents draw from the same older tradition. Whatever its origin, the Eridu Genesis remains one of the oldest and most compelling flood narratives in human history. It offers a glimpse into how the Sumerians understood their place in a world shaped by forces far older and far more powerful than themselves. And it leaves us with a haunting possibility that the first civilization remembered the end of another. The deeper scholars dive into the Eridu Genesis, the more they realize that the flood narrative is not an isolated myth, but a structural pillar of Sumerian thought, shaping how they understood time, power, and the human condition. To the Sumerians, the flood was not simply a divine punishment or a cautionary tale. It was the moment when the world reset itself, when the previous age vanished and a new, diminished humanity emerged. This worldview helps explain why so many Sumerian texts, myths, hymns, legal traditions, even astronomical observations treat the pre-flood era as fundamentally different. It was a time of greater cities, greater rulers, and perhaps even greater knowledge. After the flood, everything contracts. Lifespans shorten, cities shrink, authority becomes fractured. Civilization restarts on a smaller scale, as if the memory of what once existed lingered but could not be recovered. What makes the Sumerian account especially compelling is the tone of certainty. The text does not describe the flood with metaphorical language or poetic flourish. It reads like a report. Cities existed, the gods resolved to destroy them, a survivor was chosen, the world was engulfed, and a new order arose. When the waters receded, Ziusudra receives life everlasting and disappears into a distant land, an echo of later traditions about Noah and Utnapishtim. This recurring motif across cultures invites the unsettling thought that all these stories might share a common ancestor, a deep-rooted memory carried across continents long before writing existed.
Yet the Eridu Genesis differs from later flood stories in one important way. It places the event at a precise position in the structure of history. It does not stand alone. It sits between two eras, the age before kingship was interrupted and the age when kingship returned. The Sumerians saw authority as something cosmic that descended when conditions were right. The flood disrupted the cosmic order, forcing kingship to retreat. Only after the waters withdrew could civilization reassemble itself, beginning once again in Kish. This detail strengthens the idea that the Sumerians believed they were inheritors of a broken timeline, rather than pioneers carving out an entirely new path.
It complicates the picture in fascinating ways. Several ancient Mesopotamian cities, including Uruk, long associated with the flood survivor Ziusudra, contains thick layers of river-borne sediments consistent with large-scale flooding. These layers do not represent a global catastrophe, but they do reflect powerful events capable of erasing settlements and reshaping memory. Environmental scientists have noted that the rivers of Mesopotamia, fed by melting snows and shifting channels, could cause sudden and devastating inundations. Yet these floods, while destructive, pale in comparison to the world-ending event the Sumerians describe. This gap between geological evidence and mythological magnitude suggests that either the Sumerians amplified the memory of a real flood into cosmic proportions, or that they inherited a much older story about a catastrophe beyond the scale of anything found in Mesopotamia. Some researchers turn their attention to the ancient Persian Gulf Basin, which was once a fertile plain before rising sea levels submerged it around 8,000 years ago. If a thriving population once lived in that region, its loss to the encroaching sea could have imprinted itself deeply on long-term cultural memory. When the survivors migrated north into Mesopotamia, they may have carried stories of a homeland drowned beneath the waves. If so, the Sumerian flood narrative might preserve echoes of a real prehistoric event, one large enough to fracture ancestral memory and reshape emerging civilizations. But even this theory leaves unanswered questions. Why did the Sumerians treat the pre-flood world as more advanced than their own? Why did they describe organized cities, divine councils, and rulers with vast lifespans? Why did they use the same documentary tone for impossible eras as they used for verifiable history? And why does the flood story align so precisely with the king list's dramatic shift in reign lengths, suggesting a deliberate and coherent worldview rather than random myth-making? There is also the issue of how the Sumerians recorded knowledge. Their texts show an astonishing blend of practicality and reverence. They wrote the Eridu Genesis not only as a cosmic narrative, but also as the backbone of their historical memory. Kingship reappears after the flood as naturally as water flows or crops grow. The gods reorganize the world, cities are rebuilt, and humanity steps once more onto the stage of civilization. But this time, with limitations, as if living in the shadow of a lost age. To them, the flood explained why people no longer lived thousands of years, why cities needed to be rebuilt, and why the world felt smaller than the one their ancestors described. The Sumerians never tried to rationalize or soften the story. They recorded it as fact. Their confidence forces us to confront a possibility that traditional history often avoids, that the earliest writers did not see themselves as inventors of civilization, but as survivors of a far older legacy. Whether that legacy represents real memories of pre-agricultural societies, symbolic truths, or something more enigmatic, the Eridu Genesis preserves the sense of a world that had ended once and could end again. And if the first civilization believed the world they inherited was merely the aftermath of a forgotten epoch, then the question becomes unavoidable. What exactly was lost in that flood? Long before telescopes were invented, long before Greek astronomers mapped the heavens, and long before mathematics matured into a formal science,
The Sumerians were already watching the skies with an intensity that feels almost out of place for their era. Their tablets reveal a civilization deeply invested in understanding the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, not mythically or symbolically alone, but with a precision that continues to trouble modern scholars. What makes their astronomical knowledge so mysterious is not merely that it existed, but how detailed and mathematically accurate it was, thousands of years before such calculations should have been possible. The most famous example is the so-called Venus tablet of Amisa-Duqa, a later Babylonian copy of much older Sumerian observations. It lists the rising and setting points of Venus across a sequence of years, charting a cycle that modern astronomers know is highly complex. Venus does not behave in simple patterns. Its movements require precise, long-term tracking to record accurately. Yet the tablet's data is so exact that researchers still use it today to model ancient celestial events. Some entries match modern predictions within a margin of error too small to dismiss as coincidence. How could scribes, equipped with nothing more than the naked eye, achieve such accuracy? The question deepens when one considers what is required to track Venus effectively. Unlike the sun or moon, Venus often appears faint, close to the horizon, and only visible during twilight, a challenging time for observation. Atmospheric distortion, cloud cover, and limited visibility windows make naked eye tracking extremely difficult. Yet the Sumerians captured the planet's phases, visibility cycles, and intervals with a consistency that implies generations of careful observation.
This suggests either an unusually stable astronomical tradition stretching far back into prehistory, or a level of observational discipline that seems anachronistic for the world's first civilization. The Sumerians also divided the sky into regions known as the Paths of Enlil, Anu, and Enki, zones corresponding to northern, central, and southern celestial tracts. They recognized constellations that are still used today and developed omens based on planetary alignments, eclipses, and star movements. These omens were not random superstitions, but part of a systematic effort to interpret celestial patterns. Even if framed in religious language, the underlying observations reflect careful quantitative tracking. Their eclipse records, for instance, show an understanding of the moon's periodicity that borders on scientific. Some scholars argue that their knowledge of the Saros cycle, the 18-year pattern in which eclipses repeat, was at least partially intuitive. But intuition alone cannot explain the precision of certain tablets. An even deeper mystery lies in Sumerian references to cycles spanning centuries. Some texts describe long-term planetary patterns that require uninterrupted observation over many generations. How could a civilization only a few centuries old record phenomena with cycles far longer than the presumed age of its culture? One explanation is that the Sumerians inherited astronomical traditions from earlier peoples whose records have been lost. Another possibility is that their oral traditions preserved observations made long before the invention of writing. But even these theories struggle to explain the mathematical fluency embedded in the tablets. Further complicating matters are descriptions of phenomena that seem to fall outside normal celestial behavior, unusual star alignments, luminous events, and objects moving unpredictably through the sky. While some may represent poetic metaphors, others appear shockingly literal. A handful of tablets document red skies, unusual halos, or sudden brightenings of celestial bodies. Some of these correlate with known atmospheric or solar events. Others remain unexplained. To the Sumerians, such occurrences were not curiosities, but signs embedded within a cosmic order they sought to decode. Yet what makes Sumerian astronomy truly remarkable is not simply the data, but the worldview behind it. They believed the heavens reflected divine laws, but they also believed those laws could be studied. Their gods were not capricious forces acting at random. They embodied patterns, cycles, and measurable principles. This mindset, half religious, half empirical,
allowed the Sumerians to see the sky as a structured system worth charting carefully. It is a perspective surprisingly close to the foundations of scientific thought. Still, the existence of such knowledge in the earliest known civilization raises uncomfortable questions. How did they leap so quickly from no written tradition to detailed astronomical records? Why do some of their observations seem more precise than those made by cultures thousands of years later? And how could a society only recently emerged from prehistory track planetary cycles requiring centuries of continuous effort? Either the Sumerians achieved an extraordinary burst of intellectual development unmatched in human history, or they were the inheritors of a much older tradition, one whose records, tools, or methods did not survive the catastrophes that reshaped the ancient world. Whatever the answer, the sky they recorded is the same sky we see today. But the way they understood it suggests they knew something we have not yet rediscovered. As more tablets came to light, the picture of Sumerian astronomy grew even stranger. Their records did not merely track the movements of planets, they attempted to interpret them, classify them, and embed them into a grand system of meaning. To the Sumerians, the sky was a library, and every star was a page. They believed the heavens could be read the same way a scribe read clay, with patience, pattern, and logic. And while much of their interpretation was couched in religious language, the observational backbone was unmistakably empirical. It is this blend, this seamless fusion of myth and mathematics that continues to confound historians. Some tablets describe celestial omens with a level of structure that suggests early attempts at probability. If Venus rose in a certain part of the sky on a particular month, the omen predicted abundance. If the moon darkened unexpectedly, the omen warned of political unrest. These predictions were not random superstitions, but attempts to correlate events across years of observation. Such work required not only meticulous tracking, but institutional memory. How could a civilization at the dawn of writing accumulate enough data to build a functional omen system, unless some form of pre-literate tradition had already existed for centuries? Even more puzzling are the rare tablets that seem to capture astronomical events we can identify today. Some describe sudden bright streaks crossing the sky, likely meteors or comets. Others reference unusual planetary conjunctions. One tablet even hints at a solar storm strong enough to redden the sky, an event modern science associates with intense bursts of solar radiation. That the Sumerians recorded these occurrences with matter-of-fact clarity suggests they were attentive observers, capable of distinguishing between ordinary and extraordinary celestial behavior. It raises a question few historians ask. Were the Sumerians looking for something? Were they watching the sky because they believed it once held answers their ancestors had understood but lost? The idea is not as far-fetched as it seems. Many of their myths revolve around beings associated with the heavens, figures who descended, taught, ruled, or departed into the sky. Even if interpreted symbolically, the frequency of these motifs suggests a culture deeply aware of the sky's significance. Their temples often aligned with cardinal directions or celestial events. Their calendars reflected lunar and planetary cycles. Their kingship rituals invoked the movements of the heavens. Everything in their world tied upward, as though the sky held the blueprint of existence. Yet for all their sophistication, many mysteries remain unsolved. How did they determine the lengths of planetary cycles with such accuracy? Venus, for example, requires years of continuous monitoring to chart properly. The moon's nodal cycles, subtle shifts in its orbit, require decades. Some of the patterns the Sumerians recorded span centuries. If Sumer, as a civilization, was only a few hundred years old when these tablets were written, where did the earlier data come from? It is unlikely that scribes invented these numbers. Too many align with what modern science has confirmed. A few scholars propose that Sumer inherited astronomical knowledge from earlier Mesopotamian cultures, now lost to time. Others suggest that early humans, living in small but stable communities long before the rise of cities, tracked the sky with a dedication we underestimate. These theories offer partial explanations, but they do not address the mathematical sophistication embedded in the tablets. Accurate predictions of eclipses or Venus cycles require more than careful observation. They require understanding periodicity, rhythm, and long-term pattern recognition. This is not the work of a culture just learning to write. Another possibility is that the Sumerians did not begin at zero. Their myths often speak of an earlier age, an era before the flood, when knowledge flowed differently and the world operated under another set of rules. Whether this represents real historical memory, symbolic narrative, or something else entirely, it's clear that the Sumerians saw themselves as inheritors, not inventors.
Their astronomy reflects this worldview. It feels less like a new science and more like a revived one. Even modern astronomers admit that some Sumerian observations are difficult to explain. A handful of tablets note planetary irregularities that would require exceptional precision to detect. Others show awareness of cycles that only become obvious after generations of tracking. How did the first civilization reach such depth so quickly? Why did their earliest known records already show advanced thinking? Perhaps the most telling clue lies in their attitude toward knowledge. The Sumerians believed that wisdom, true wisdom, was something older than humanity. They believed it existed before cities, before kings, before the flood. To them, knowledge was a gift preserved, not created. And whether or not that belief reflects historical reality, it shaped everything they wrote. Their astronomy endures as both a triumph and a challenge. A triumph of human curiosity at the dawn of civilization, and a challenge to our understanding of how quickly and how mysteriously knowledge can emerge. Long before their stories were filtered through later cultures, long before modern writers reimagined them in alien or mythical terms, the Sumerians described a pantheon of beings they called the Anunnaki. Figures who shaped the world, established order, and interacted directly with humanity. These beings appear again and again in Sumerian tablets, not as distant cosmic abstractions, but as active participants in the unfolding of early civilization. What makes their presence so intriguing is not the supernatural speculation often attached to them in popular narratives, but the way the Sumerians themselves portrayed them. Authoritative, knowledgeable, and intimately involved in the origins of kingship, law, agriculture, and craft. To understand the Anunnaki, one must step into the Sumerian worldview. They did not see their gods as transcendent entities dwelling in unreachable heavens. Instead, the gods occupied specific cities, lived in temples, issued decrees, and maintained cosmic and earthly order. Each major city-state had a patron deity: Enki in Eridu, Enlil in Nippur, Inanna in Uruk. Yet these gods were not merely symbolic. They were depicted as founding rulers, judges, architects, and scholars. Their roles blur the line between divine presence and historical memory. Whether understood literally or metaphorically, the Sumerians believed that civilization began when these beings descended and taught humanity how to live. This concept, knowledge being delivered from above, appears in every major Sumerian myth. Kingship is lowered from heaven. Agriculture is revealed. Writing is given. Craftsmen receive guidance from divine instructors. Even irrigation, the lifeblood of Mesopotamian cities, is attributed to teachings from the gods. This repeated theme has led some modern researchers to wonder whether the Sumerians were preserving memories of real individuals or groups who played formative roles in early cultural development. Yet interpreting these texts literally risks misunderstanding a worldview where myth and history operate on overlapping planes. Still, There is something unusual about the specificity with which the Sumerians describe the Anunnaki. They list their names, their functions, their hierarchies, their disputes, and even their residences. They portray them issuing laws, resolving conflicts, and dividing territories among humans. In one myth, the gods convene a council to allocate responsibilities for shaping the world. In another, they establish ritual calendars aligned with celestial cycles. These stories reflect more than religious devotion. They reflect an attempt to encode knowledge in narrative form, to translate foundational truths into memorable, authoritative tales. But the mysteries deepen when one compares these Sumerian descriptions with myths from other ancient cultures. The idea of powerful beings descending from the sky appears in Egyptian lore, in Greek legends, in Hindu texts, in Native American traditions. In many of these cases, the beings bring knowledge, technology, agriculture, or order. Such cross-cultural parallels raise the question of whether these stories share an origin deeper than any one civilization's imagination. Either humanity independently developed similar metaphors to explain the rise of civilization, or these myths carry echoes of a forgotten chapter in human prehistory. Within Sumer itself, the Anunnaki were not consistently portrayed as remote or abstract. In temple hymns, they maintained the cosmic balance. In royal inscriptions, they chose kings. In administrative texts, they were invoked to legitimize land claims or contracts. Their presence permeated daily life, yet always in a framework that suggested they once acted directly, not symbolically, in human affairs. The Sumerians did not portray themselves as inventors of their institutions. They portrayed themselves as recipients, inheritors, continuers of a plan established before their time. This attitude reveals much about how the Sumerians viewed their own achievements. Their cities did not arise from trial and error. They followed patterns believed to be established by the gods. Their laws did not evolve slowly. They were revealed through divine authority. Their measurements, their rituals, their calendars, all were rooted in cosmic order. Whether or not one accepts the literal truth of these beliefs, they reflect a culture convinced that wisdom has an origin outside the human domain. Modern scholarship tries to interpret these myths as allegories for natural forces or political systems. Enlil represents the storm and the unpredictable power of nature. Enki embodies water, wisdom, and adaptability. Inanna symbolizes fertility and conflict. These interpretations make sense within a symbolic framework, but they do not fully account for the Sumerians' insistence on historicizing these beings, giving them genealogies, councils, residences, and administrative roles. Nor do they explain why the gods are consistently linked with the origins of knowledge, writing, astronomy, and kingship. The Sumerians themselves never framed their gods as metaphors. They recorded their actions with the same matter-of-fact tone they used to document taxes or grain deliveries. This does not mean the gods were literal beings as we understand them today, but it does suggest that the Sumerians believed they were preserving real events, events that marked the boundary between a world without civilization and a world shaped by order, instruction, and law. And if the first civilization believed that its foundational knowledge came not from human experimentation, but from beings associated with the sky, then perhaps the question is not whether these beings existed in a literal sense. The real question may be, what happened in humanity's earliest memory that led so many cultures across so many continents to tell the same story? As the stories of the Anunnaki spread across Sumer's cities, their roles grew more intricate, revealing a worldview in which divine and human destinies were entangled. What makes these narratives especially compelling is how consistently they portray the gods as bearers of structure, time, law, agriculture, writing, rather than mere creators of storms or fertility. They are depicted as organizers, planners, instructors.
Even when the myths become dramatic, filled with rivalry and cosmic tension, the underlying theme remains the same. The Anunnaki shape the order of the world, and humanity follows that blueprint. One of the most intriguing aspects of these stories is the way they describe transitions between ages. In several myths, the gods deliberate over the state of humanity, debating whether humans are ready for certain knowledge or whether they should remain limited. In others, the gods withdraw from active involvement, leaving kings to carry forward the divine mandate. These myths echo the idea of a once direct relationship between humanity and powerful beings that gradually faded over time, an idea mirrored in traditions across the ancient world. Whether these reflect symbolic storytelling or distant cultural memory, they hint at a perceived golden age before the present, a time when knowledge flowed more freely and the boundary between worlds was thinner. What complicates matters is that the Sumerians embedded these narratives within their political and administrative systems. Kings routinely invoked the authority of specific gods to justify their actions, claiming they were chosen or guided by the Anunnaki. Temple rituals reenacted mythic events as if they were not stories but historical milestones. Even land contracts and legal proceedings sometimes referenced divine decrees, anchoring human law in cosmic precedent. This integration blurs any neat distinction between religion and history. To the Sumerians,
The gods were not abstract concepts. They were part of the same timeline that humans inhabited. Yet the more one examines these myths, the more they seem to preserve a recurring pattern. Beings associated with the sky descend, impart knowledge, and then withdraw. The withdrawal is always partial, never complete, leaving humanity to govern with fragments of a larger system once understood in full. This motif appears in Egypt, Greece, India, Mesoamerica, and numerous indigenous traditions. The similarities are striking enough that scholars have long debated whether these stories reflect archetypal psychology or remnants of shared cultural memory reaching deep into prehistory. If they do reflect memory, then the Sumerian versions, among the earliest written, may be the closest surviving echoes of that forgotten era. Sumerian art reinforces this ambiguity. Many cylinder seals depict figures emerging from or returning to celestial realms, interacting with humans in scenes that blend ritual with instruction. Some show tools, plants, or symbols being passed from gods to humans, suggesting a transfer of knowledge rather than mere worship. Others portray elaborate cosmic diagrams with humans positioned beneath structured layers representing heaven, earth, and the underworld. These images hint at a cosmology where the universe was not chaotic, but governed by predictable laws, laws understood by the gods and partially revealed to humans. One cannot ignore how this worldview aligns with Sumer's rapid rise in technology and organization. If the Sumerians believed that knowledge originated from divine instruction, they would have approached learning not as invention, but as discovery, a process of remembering rather than creating. This mentality could explain their early emphasis on record-keeping, standardization, and the preservation of tradition. A society convinced that its knowledge has cosmic origins would treat that knowledge as sacred, immutable, and essential to maintain. Such reverence might also accelerate the development of structured institutions, including schools, legal codes, and scientific observation. Still, the question persists: why do the Sumerians describe these beings with such specificity? Mythological beings in other cultures often lack precise genealogies or defined administrative functions, but in Sumer, the Anunnaki have clear hierarchies, responsibilities, and political influence. They preside over councils, issue rulings, and enforce cosmic order. This level of detail has led some to speculate that the stories reflect symbolic memories of real individuals, leaders, teachers, or outsiders whose influence became mythologized over centuries. If true, the Anunnaki might represent not literal gods, but the transformative figures who catalyzed early civilization.
Others argue that these stories reveal psychological truths, that the Sumerians, witnessing the sudden rise of cities, irrigation, writing, and mathematics, could only explain such rapid progress by attributing it to external forces. In this interpretation, the Anunnaki are metaphors for the awe-inspiring leap from prehistory to civilization. Yet this raises its own puzzle. Why did this leap occur so abruptly, and why in Sumer, of all places? Why does the earliest civilization tell stories suggesting it inherited its knowledge rather than discovering it? Ultimately, the enduring power of the Anunnaki myths lies not in whether the gods literally descended from the sky, but in what the stories reveal about the Sumerian view of history. They saw themselves as successors, not pioneers, as custodians of a system older than humanity. And whether their myths reflect metaphor, memory, or something else entirely, they leave behind a provocative question. If civilization was indeed a gift from an earlier age, what happened to the world that came before?
As excavations across Mesopotamia uncovered more tablets, scholars began encountering texts that did not fit neatly into categories of myth, history, or science. These were the outliers, the strange pieces that seemed too advanced, too symbolic, or too fragmentary to interpret with confidence. Some contained diagrams of unknown purpose, others listed objects or measurements that made little sense, and a few described phenomena that sounded uncannily modern. Together they formed a body of material often labeled controversial, not because they were fraudulent or misunderstood, but because their implications were difficult to reconcile with what we believe about early civilization. These are the Sumerian records that challenge the boundaries of explanation. One such text depicts a configuration of the heavens with a central star surrounded by orbiting bodies. Scholars typically interpret this as a symbolic representation of celestial order, but some researchers argue it resembles a schematic of the solar system, complete with planets arranged around a central sun. While mainstream interpretations caution against reading too much into the imagery, it is undeniable that the Sumerians possessed an unusually structured view of the cosmos. Whether intentional or coincidental, the resemblance unsettles those who assume ancient people lacked the sophistication for such conceptual models. Another enigmatic set of tablets contains what appear to be instructions for constructing ritual spaces or temple complexes, detailing dimensions, angles, and layouts with mathematical precision. These texts read less like myth and more like architectural blueprints. Some contain measurements expressed in units so consistent that modern engineers have been able to reconstruct scale models simply by following the instructions. Yet the purposes of these structures remain unclear. Were they temples, observatories, ceremonial platforms, or something else entirely? The ambiguity arises because the Sumerians rarely differentiated between sacred and scientific functions. A structure could serve astronomical, ritual, administrative, and symbolic roles simultaneously. Perhaps the most puzzling tablets are those that refer to unusual celestial events, stars that wandered, lights that appeared suddenly and vanished, objects that shone brightly then dimmed over successive days. These descriptions do not match ordinary meteor showers or comets. Some researchers propose atmospheric phenomena or volcanic reflections, while others consider them exaggerated mythic motifs. Yet the tone of these entries is clinical, almost observational. They do not read like embellished stories. They read like logs, records meant to be referenced later, perhaps for omens or for understanding annual cycles. A handful of tablets even describe catastrophic events that some interpret as cosmic in nature, impacts, fiery storms, or sudden darkness. Mainstream scholars are cautious here, pointing out that ancient languages often use dramatic imagery to describe political or agricultural crises. Still, the specificity of certain passages raises eyebrows. One text, for instance,
describes a star of red fire that split the sky and roared like a beast, leaving the land trembling. Another mentions the great smoke of heaven blotting out the sun. If these refer to real events, meteors, volcanic eruptions, or large dust storms, they may offer glimpses of disasters that shaped early human memory. Some tablets go further still, detailing lists of unfamiliar objects or compounds that appear technological in character. These interpretations are controversial, and mainstream scholars insist that such readings stem from mistranslations or overactive imagination. Yet it is undeniable that several texts describe tools, materials, or processes whose purposes are unknown. They could be ritual items, symbolic metaphors, or lost forms of craftsmanship. But their precise terminology, combined with their appearance alongside mathematical instructions, leaves room for curiosity. Another category of controversial tablets includes those that depict hybrid beings or creatures not found in the natural world. While most scholars interpret these as mythological symbols, a few researchers argue they may represent attempts to encode genetic or medical observations in symbolic form. The Sumerians were not biologists, yet they possessed a surprising understanding of bodily functions, illnesses, and herbal remedies. Whether the hybrid imagery reflects medical experimentation, symbolic cosmology, or pure myth remains a matter of debate. What all these records share is a quality that feels out of place. They point to knowledge that either was far ahead of its time or inherited from sources we cannot identify. They force us to consider whether Sumer's intellectual world was shaped by experiences or traditions older than the civilization itself. They also remind us how little we understand about the earliest chapters of human history. We assume that progress follows a straight line, that knowledge accumulates epoch by epoch. But the Sumerian tablets suggest a different narrative, one where sudden genius can appear without warning, where fragments of forgotten wisdom can resurface unexpectedly, and where the boundaries between disciplines are not rigid, but fluid. These records do not prove anything extraordinary by themselves, but taken together, they create a mosaic of anomalies, small but persistent clues hinting at a more complex past. They invite questions that conventional timelines struggle to answer. Why did the first civilization know so much? Why did they organize their world with such mathematical and cosmological precision? And how did they produce texts that still defy complete interpretation thousands of years later? If the uncontroversial tablets reveal the brilliance of Sumer, the controversial ones reveal its depths. Depths that may hold the key to understanding what shaped the world before the world we know. As archaeologists uncovered more of these strange tablets, one theme began to emerge. The Sumerians were recording things they clearly believed were important, even if their purpose is no longer obvious to us. Some of the most perplexing texts are those filled with dense symbols that do not belong to any known linguistic category. They are not clearly numbers, words, or drawings. They resemble schematic diagrams, grids, spirals, intersecting lines, and shapes that appear mathematical in intent but lack explanatory notes. Scholars have suggested everything from star maps to ritual mandalas to proto-engineering plans. Yet none of these interpretations fully match the structure of the symbols. The uncomfortable truth is that we still do not know what these tablets were meant to convey. Then there are tablets describing rituals involving precise timing, sequences of movements, and chants connected to celestial events. These might seem purely religious, yet the timing instructions often align with lunar cycles or planetary transitions. Why would religious ceremonies require such astronomical accuracy? Was it symbolic? Or did the Sumerians believe these rituals interacted with cosmic forces in ways we no longer understand? Some researchers propose that the rituals preserved ancient calendar-keeping methods, Others speculate that they encoded observations into performance. Either way, the precision is difficult to dismiss. Certain fragments reference objects that behave like tools, yet their functions remain mysterious. Words translated as the stone that speaks, the metal that remembers, or the light of measurement have sparked endless debate. These terms may simply be poetic metaphors, but their consistency across multiple cities suggests they were standard items. Without surviving physical artifacts, wood, fiber, and soft metals do not preserve well. We are left with descriptions that may hint at early scientific instruments now lost to time. One of the most debated tablets lists a sequence of numbers arranged in a pattern that mathematicians find startlingly modern. The tablet shows alternating rows of numbers that seem to encode ratios or periodic cycles. Some scholars interpret it as a multiplication or reciprocal table, similar to later Babylonian mathematics. Others believe it tracks complex astronomical intervals. Most controversial is the idea that it might represent early harmonic or geometric relationships, implying an understanding of numerical patterns far ahead of Sumer's era. While mainstream historians reject sensational interpretations, they still acknowledge the tablet contains structures difficult to explain without assuming a sophisticated mathematical tradition. Even more enigmatic are the tablets depicting beings that combine human, animal, and symbolic features. These images often appear in contexts that suggest teaching moments, figures handing over objects, pointing to stars, or standing beside architectural shapes. While these hybrids are almost certainly mythological, their roles in the scenes are ambiguous. Are they explanatory symbols, archetypes, allegorical teachers, or do they represent older, pre-Sumerian mythologies whose meanings were preserved but no longer understood by later scribes? Some texts describe journeys taken by priests, kings, or heroes to distant lands beyond the 7 mountains or across the deep abyss. These phrases could refer metaphorically to spiritual realms, but they could also reference real geographic locations. If civilizations existed in the Persian Gulf Basin or other now flooded areas, these stories might echo migrations or explorations long forgotten. It is striking that the Sumerians often portrayed these journeys as quests for knowledge, not conquest, suggesting that distant regions were associated with specialized wisdom or lost traditions. Taken together, these controversial tablets present a picture of a civilization wrestling with ideas that push against the boundaries of what we assume early humans understood. Their records are neither crude nor naive. They are layered, symbolic, technical, and occasionally startlingly abstract. And because they come from the earliest known civilization, they raise a question modern history has not resolved. How did the first societies to write produce material that we still struggle to interpret? One explanation is that we underestimate the cognitive and cultural capabilities of ancient people. Another is that Sumer inherited fragments of knowledge from pre-literate cultures that vanished at the end of the Ice Age. Perhaps the most intriguing possibility is that a combination of these forces survived the upheavals that shaped early human history, leaving behind a mosaic of hints scattered across clay. Even if none of the controversial interpretations prove extraordinary, the fact remains that the Sumerians encoded knowledge in forms unfamiliar to us. They thought in ways that blend myth, mathematics, astronomy, ritual, and storytelling, ways that modern categories cannot cleanly dissect. This difficulty in classification may reveal more about our limitations than theirs. In the end, these tablets, enigmatic, half-understood, and often unsettling, force us to confront a humbling possibility: that the past is deeper, stranger, and more complex than the linear narrative we have constructed. And if Sumer truly carried fragments of knowledge from worlds erased by time, then these texts might be the last surviving echoes of a forgotten human story.
As scholars pieced together the thousands of Sumerian tablets, an unsettling pattern began to emerge, one that few were willing to acknowledge openly at first. Beneath the impressive achievements of Sumer, beneath its cities, mathematics, governance, and mythology, there were traces of something older. Subtle, scattered, half-buried clues hinted that the Sumerians might not have been the beginning of civilization, but inheritors of knowledge far older than their own age. These hints appeared not only in myth or symbolism, but in archaeology, in architectural foundations, in inexplicable jumps in technology, and in the deep confidence with which they recorded events allegedly occurring long before their culture existed. The first clue lies in the earliest settlement layers of Eridu, traditionally considered the oldest city in the world. Excavations revealed nearly 20 distinct construction levels stacked atop one another, each representing a rebuilding phase. Yet even the lowest, oldest layers show a sophistication unexpected for humanity's supposed first attempt at city building. The idea that Eridu began as a small shrine gradually expanded over centuries remains the mainstream view, but the coherence and precision of its earliest stages suggests that the builders already understood the principles of temple architecture. No stumbling, no primitive experimentation, only refinement. Elsewhere, in cities like Uruk and Kish, archaeologists discovered that new buildings were erected directly atop older ones, often preserving the original layouts. This continuity implies memory, either a memory of earlier cultures or a tradition so strong that the Sumerians felt bound to recreate what came before. In some cases, the oldest foundations are harder to date or differ stylistically from later structures, sparking debates about whether pre-Sumerian peoples occupied the same sites. Yet written records are silent about such earlier inhabitants, leaving us with a puzzle. If Sumer was truly the first civilization, why does the archaeological footprint look inherited rather than invented? Another line of evidence comes from technology. The Sumerians appear in the historical record already skilled in irrigation engineering. Their earliest canals are well designed, with gradients calculated to prevent erosion and stagnation. Such precision typically requires generations of trial and error, agricultural crises, and environmental adaptation. But there is no sign of such a learning curve in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians begin with mastery, as if copying a system already tested elsewhere. Some researchers propose that pre-agricultural cultures experimented with water management in now submerged regions, such as the Persian Gulf Basin. If human groups lived there before rising sea levels drowned the landscape, they might have carried their knowledge north into Mesopotamia during periods of migration. Mythology provides another provocative clue. The Sumerians consistently wrote about a world before theirs, a structured, organized era ruled by kings and overseen by divine beings. The flood, in their view, did not wipe out primitive tribes, but cities, temples, and institutions. This portrayal is anomalous. Most civilizations describe their earliest ancestors as nomadic or semi-formed, not as rulers presiding over advanced societies. Why did the Sumerians imagine the pre-flood world as so similar to their own, and in some ways superior? Did they inherit stories of real settlements destroyed by climate catastrophes thousands of years earlier? The Sumerian king list intensifies the mystery. It provides a written chronology of rulers stretching back into deep time, far longer than any accepted human societal timeline allows. Scholars generally interpret these long reigns symbolically, yet the consistency across copies and cities suggests the numbers mattered to the Sumerians. They believed in cycles of history, periods separated by disaster and rebirth. Where did that belief originate? Why begin their historical memory at a place modern archaeology cannot reach? The abruptness of Sumer's rise remains one of the most confounding questions.
Civilizations do not appear out of nowhere, yet Sumer seems to. No comparable precursors exist nearby. The Neolithic cultures that preceded them lacked the complexity required to transform into city-states so quickly. It is as if someone compressed a millennium of development into a few centuries, or as if Sumer was built on remnants of a world erased by time. This theory gains weight when considering the Younger Dryas, the abrupt climate shift roughly 12,800 years ago that triggered massive flooding and forced migrations worldwide. If advanced or semi-advanced groups existed during the late Ice Age, their settlements, likely built along coastlines, river deltas, or fertile basins, would now lie underwater or buried under thick layers of sediment. The Sumerians, arriving thousands of years later, may have absorbed the scattered descendants or the fragmented oral traditions of these lost peoples. Even their writing system supports this interpretation. Cuneiform appears fully formed, with no transitional scribbles. It is a functional script from the start, capable of expressing complex ideas. For the first writers of history to produce such a system in one leap strains belief. Either the Sumerians were a rare intellectual anomaly, or they adapted an older conceptual framework now lost to time. Their attitude toward knowledge, treating it as something given, not invented, aligns with the latter interpretation. Perhaps the strongest evidence, however, lies in the Sumerians' own self-perception. They did not view themselves as the first humans to understand the world. They saw themselves as custodians of traditions older than memory. They spoke of rebuilding, not building, restoring, not creating, continuing, not beginning. If Sumer indeed carried echoes of an earlier civilization, then the question becomes not whether such a civilization existed, but how much of it survives in the fragments we possess. If the hints scattered throughout Sumer's archaeology, mythology, and astronomy suggest inherited knowledge, then part 2 of this puzzle lies in examining how those hints converge and how they quietly reshape everything we assume about early human history. The more closely we study the Sumerians, the more we realize their civilization behaves like a reboot rather than a beginning, a restoration rather than a first attempt. Their achievements are not incremental. They are sudden, cohesive, and startlingly mature. One of the strongest indicators of inheritance lies in their myths surrounding craftsmanship and technology. The Sumerians attributed the origins of metalworking, brickmaking, agriculture, and writing not to human inventors but to divine or semi-divine figures. Even the mundane, tools, irrigation systems, city layouts, are described as having heavenly precedents. This worldview makes little sense unless the Sumerians were drawing from traditions older than themselves, traditions so ancient that their human origins had faded into the realm of legend. When a society treats innovation as revelation, it may be because the true origin of its knowledge is obscured by time. There is also the matter of their sudden mastery of administration. Bureaucracy does not evolve overnight. Systems of taxation, standardized weights and measures, legal codes, and economic record-keeping typically develop slowly as societies expand. But in Sumer, these systems appear from the earliest tablets already structured, with no experimental phases or primitive forerunners. Their standardized accounting tokens, the precursors to writing, suggest an even older tradition of abstraction and symbolism. Yet these tokens do not seem to originate in Sumer. They appear to have migrated in from somewhere else, only to be transformed into cuneiform. It is as if Sumer inherited a concept, record-keeping, and elevated it into the world's first writing system. Another key element lies in Sumer's social complexity. Hierarchies, priesthoods, specialized labor, large-scale agriculture, and state religion all emerge rapidly within a few centuries. This speed is anomalous. Most early societies require long periods of gradual organization, often punctuated by collapses or regressions. But Sumer advances almost linearly toward complexity, a sign that its people may have had templates, ideological, architectural, or administrative, to follow. These templates could have been inherited through migration, oral tradition, or the faint memory of a prior society that once inhabited lands now submerged or eroded beyond recognition. Environmental clues deepen the mystery. Geological studies show that vast regions around the ancient Persian Gulf were once dry, fertile plains capable of sustaining early human settlements. As sea levels rose after the Ice Age, these regions drowned slowly, forcing populations to migrate north. If these groups carried with them agricultural knowledge, early social structures, or even proto-symbolic systems, they might have seeded the cultural explosion that later emerged as Sumer. This theory does not require a lost, advanced civilization, only a well-organized prehistoric one. But it still challenges the standard timeline by suggesting that civilization's roots extend deeper than we currently acknowledge. The Sumerians themselves left verbal footprints pointing in this direction. Their myths speak of forgotten cities, of eras when humanity lived in harmony with divine instructors, of councils that divided the world, and of catastrophes that erased entire generations. They did not claim to invent kingship. They claimed to restore it after the flood. They did not claim to create the arts of civilization. They claimed to recover them. Even their earliest kings are described as continuing something older, not starting something new. If these myths are distorted memories of real events, then the Sumerians may have been the heirs of knowledge preserved through disaster. But perhaps the most unsettling clues lie in the gaps, the things missing from Sumer's record. For a civilization so obsessed with writing, they never explained how they discovered writing. For a culture that tracked celestial cycles with precision, they never documented the origins of their astronomical methods. For a people who credited the gods with their knowledge, they never fully described how that knowledge was transmitted. These omissions are not accidental. They reflect a worldview in which certain truths were simply inherited, not created. The first writers of history acted as though history had begun long before them. The abruptness of Sumer's innovation also raises the possibility of cultural memory surviving through bottlenecks, eras when humanity nearly collapsed due to climate, famine, or migration. Knowledge can survive such bottlenecks in fragmented form, carried by small groups and resurfacing generations later. When conditions stabilize, that knowledge can blossom suddenly, producing the illusion of a civilization springing up overnight. This phenomenon is known in anthropology, yet the scale and precision of Sumer's achievements push the concept to its limits. If they were the inheritors of lost traditions, then those traditions must have been far more sophisticated than any we currently know from the late Neolithic period. In the end, what emerges is a picture not of a culture inventing civilization from scratch, but of a culture standing on the shoulders of forgotten predecessors. Whether these predecessors were Ice Age communities, pre-flood settlements around the Gulf, or entirely unknown cultures buried under millennia of sediment, we cannot yet say. But the evidence, textual, archaeological, astronomical, and mythological, suggests that Sumer did not ignite human civilization out of nowhere. It rekindled a flame that had burned before. And if the first civilization we recognize was itself a continuation, then our timeline does not begin with Sumer. It begins with something older, deeper, and far more elusive, something the Sumerians remembered only in fragments, and which we now must reconstruct from the whispers they left behind. By the time we reach the end of the Sumerian record, the myths, the king lists, the astronomical tables, the architectural plans, the strange diagrams, the flood narratives, one realization becomes impossible to ignore. These ancient tablets do not simply describe a civilization. They challenge the foundations of our understanding of human history. The Sumerians were the first people to write, yet they wrote as though they were remembering. They were the first to build cities, yet they built as though following instructions. They were the first to formalize law, astronomy, administration, and mathematics, yet they acted as though these were not creations but restorations of something older. If the earliest chapters of the human story are written by a culture claiming they inherited their knowledge, then how much confidence can we place in the assumption that human civilization began around 5,000 years ago? This question is uncomfortable for modern science because it suggests that our current timeline may be incomplete, not wrong, but partial, like a book with missing pages. The Sumerians themselves believed they lived after a great rupture, a flood that erased an earlier world and reset humanity. Whether literal or symbolic, this belief shaped the way they documented time. They divided history into before and after, not according to dynasties, but according to cosmic cycles. And this is where the Sumerian records become more than archaeological curiosities. They raise implications. If their king lists preserve distorted memories of earlier rulers, then human social complexity may have existed long before the formal archaeological record shows it. If their astronomical observations reflect inherited data, then early skywatchers may have tracked celestial cycles for far longer than we currently imagine. If their myths preserve fragments of real migrations or catastrophes, then the origins of civilization may lie not in a sudden miracle in Mesopotamia, but in the gradual recovery of knowledge after a forgotten collapse. The flood narrative alone suggests this possibility. The Sumerians described it not as a mythic punishment, but as a historical boundary, something that severed one age from another. Archaeology supports the existence of massive environmental upheavals at the end of the Ice Age, including rapid sea level rise that drowned entire regions. If human groups lived in those flooded areas, their achievements may now lie under hundreds of meters of water, unreachable by conventional excavation. In that light, the sudden appearance of cities, writing, and engineering in Sumer becomes less mysterious. It is the resurfacing of intellectual traditions from communities displaced by climate catastrophe. Yet even this explanation does not fully account for the anomalies. The precision of Sumerian astronomical records still demands centuries of data. Their mathematics, the sexagesimal system, appears without prototypes. Their city planning is too coordinated to be first generation. Their myths are too cohesive, too structured, too specific. It is as though the Sumerians were rebuilding civilization using a manual whose earlier chapters were missing. They remembered the framework, but not the details, the concepts, but not the origins. This would explain why their myths attribute knowledge to gods instead of ancestors. Perhaps they no longer knew who originally developed it. One of the most striking aspects of their worldview is their insistence that kingship, law, and cosmic order descend from above. Modern scholars interpret this symbolically, but the consistency of the phrase suggests a deeper truth. The Sumerians believed that human institutions had a non-human origin, or at least a pre-human one. Whether this represents divine revelation, anthropological memory, or mythologized recollection of earlier societies, it challenges our assumption that civilization evolved only through linear progress. The Sumerians portray civilization as a restored pattern, a template that reemerges after catastrophe. There is also the uncomfortable issue of their technological metaphors. Terms like the metal that remembers or the stone that speaks may simply be poetic, but they appear in contexts associated with measurement, record-keeping, and ritual calibration. If these terms refer to lost tools or symbolic remnants of instruments once used for tracking time, aligning temples, or measuring land, then it suggests the Sumerians worked within a framework inherited from a pre-writing scientific tradition. Such a tradition, if it existed, would have left minimal archaeological evidence, especially if its practitioners lived in regions now lost underwater or eroded beyond recognition. The more one contemplates the full Sumerian corpus, the more it feels like an echo too structured, too coherent, too advanced to dismiss as coincidence. If Sumer truly represents the rebirth of civilization after a long hiatus, then our current understanding of human development is missing entire chapters. Science may eventually fill these gaps with new discoveries, but for now, the tablets remain the best clues we possess. They whisper of ages before the flood, of kings whose memories stretched across millennia, of celestial cycles older than written history, of knowledge handed down rather than invented. And perhaps the most astonishing implication is this. If the Sumerian records are even partially true, then humanity's story is not one of gradual ascent from simplicity, but one of repeated rises and falls, a pattern far older and more cyclical than we once believed. The origins of civilization may lie not in Sumer itself, but in the remnants of worlds washed away. If there is one message that echoes through every Sumerian tablet, from the practical to the poetic, from the mundane to the mystical, it is that the world we inhabit is not the first version of civilization. Again and again, the texts imply an earlier order, a more complete knowledge, a pattern humanity once understood but later lost. The Sumerians wrote not like pioneers charting unknown territory, but like heirs rebuilding a fallen estate. Their confidence, their precision, their mythic memory, everything suggests they were piecing together fragments of an inheritance older than any surviving artifact. Modern science approaches these ideas cautiously because evidence must be physical, datable, measurable. Yet absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when we consider how much of humanity's earliest past lies beneath oceans, deserts, and layers of earth untouched by archaeology. The Sumerians left clues that do not fit within clean chronological boundaries, but they left them consistently, intentionally, and with remarkable detail. Their worldview, expressed across thousands of tablets, is not chaotic. It is structured, encoded, purposeful. It is the worldview of a people who believed they were living in the aftermath of something immense. Their king lists preserve reigns so long they defy biological possibility. Their flood narratives describe events on a scale far larger than local river disasters. Their astronomical records require observational continuity no young civilization should possess. Their myths reference teachers, builders, and bringers of knowledge who come from beyond the human world. Each of these elements can be dismissed individually, but together they form a tapestry too rich to ignore. Even the way the Sumerians handled time feels alien to us. They measured history not from creation, but from rupture, from the moment the old world ended. For them, the flood was not metaphor, but memory, the dividing line between two civilizations. If their stories reflect even a distorted recollection of late Ice Age catastrophes, then the roots of civilization extend thousands of years deeper into the past than our current timelines allow. So much could have been lost. Cities swallowed by rising seas, agricultural societies erased by climate reversal, knowledge scattered among migrating groups. What the Sumerians preserved may be only the fragments that survived. The greatest challenge these tablets pose is not that they contradict modern history, but that they suggest history is incomplete. They invite us to consider that civilization may not be a linear ascent, but a cycle, a rhythm of rise, collapse, and rebirth. In this model, Sumer is not the first spark of human brilliance, but the first spark we can still read. Others may have burned just as brightly before, leaving no written trace. And then there's the question of knowledge. Why did the Sumerians insist that wisdom was given, not invented? Why were writing, astronomy, kingship, agriculture, and law described as gifts, tools passed down to humanity from beings associated with the sky or the deep past? Was this simply mythologizing, or did they truly believe they were remembering? Cultures do not invent stories of inheritance unless they perceive themselves as inheritors. Something in their collective memory convinced them that knowledge arrived from outside their direct experience. Whether that outside refers to older human societies, long-lost teachers, or symbolic expressions of the unknown, their conviction is unmistakable. Sumer forces us to confront the limits of what we know about early humanity. The tablets ask questions without offering answers. They remind us that archaeology is vulnerable to time, that entire epochs can vanish, leaving only scattered clues. They show us that even the earliest writers sensed a profound depth behind their own history, a depth they tried to honor, record, and preserve for those who would come after. And now, thousands of years later, we are the ones reading their words, wondering what lies beneath the surface of their stories. Were the Sumerians remembering a world we have forgotten? Were their gods distant memories of real figures? Were their astronomical tables distilled from knowledge carried through ages of upheaval? Were their myths metaphors for human resilience, or records of events so ancient that their origins faded into cosmic language? The truth may lie somewhere in between, part history, part legend, part scientific observation encoded in symbolic form. But what matters most is that the Sumerians refused to see themselves as the starting point of civilization. They saw themselves as a continuation, a renewal, a reconstruction. And if the first civilization saw itself this way, then what does that mean for us? Perhaps the greatest lesson hidden in the clay tablets is not about Sumer at all, but about humanity. We are far older, far more layered, and far more cyclical than we realize. Our past is not a straight line, but a spiral, one that winds backward into forgotten ages and forward into futures we have yet to imagine. The Sumerians left us a message carved in clay, surviving the rise and fall of empires, surviving floods, wars, and the erosion of time. A message as simple as it is profound. This is not the beginning. Remember what came before.